My name's Kim Sorvig when I'm not being called Kimu. Welcome everyone, both on-site and online. I'm going to talk today about Japanese gardens as embodied practice. Just before Ongo this year, Enkyo Roshi discussed a new book called Gardens of Awakening with photos by my good friend and former Aikido student, Mitsue Nagase, and text by Sensei Kaz Tanahashi. Knowing the previous work of both of the authors, I'm sure that it's going to be a wonderful and intimate evocation of the aesthetics of the great Zen gardens. I'm looking forward to reading the whole thing and already second Roshi's urging that we should all read it. The reason I picked this topic, among others, is that I just spent the better part of July in Japan, which, if you know Japan, means I was crazy. It was 97 degrees Fahrenheit and 90% humidity virtually the whole time I was there. But I had gotten the opportunity to participate in a course on traditional methods of actually building Japanese gardens. I knew something beforehand about their design, but this really allowed me to learn something about the making of gardening. I'm offering this in the spirit of an expansion on Kaz and Mitsue's insight that gardens are places of awakening. I'd like to share some of the meaning and joy that I've found in especially Japanese gardens that comes from the making of them rather than from thinking about their overall design and aesthetics. The two should be complementary, I hope. This is not going to be a technical talk about garden architecture. It's certainly not going to be a critic's views and opinions. Just a personal reflection on getting my hands dirty, my back really sweaty, and making a garden. We used almost no machinery or power tools. They were adjuncts for the traditional methods. Few nails, none of that awful stuff called construction adhesive, no cement, concrete, tar, or zip screws. And these knots were a big part of the satisfaction that I got from working with a crew to make a small Japanese style garden. It makes for a quiet workplace and it makes for a very meditative way of working, even when the work is at its most intense. So we began by unceremoniously removing all of the previous classes' work. Boulders, pavers, lamps, fountains, the sectional stone pagodas, every plant from bamboo to moss were taken up and put into storage for our student garden making. This was a study garden, but it's important to recognize that almost every garden actually begins with removal of existing elements of the site. And it's kind of a paradox about gardens, which are a strange in-between of nature and human construction. And it reminds me of what we call in Zen killing to give life, which in clearing a space for a new garden, we do both metaphorically and literally. Similarly, shoveling out our mental debris and overgrowth is an essential beginning for practice and an ongoing part of practice. So I am going to attempt something never before done in this Zendo, perhaps, And I'm going to share my screen and show you a few images. I will still be talking, but you won't have to look at my lovely face for the entire time. I'm hoping to give you something more interesting. So bear with me a second while I share the screen. Okay, let's see if I can get this. As I said, I'm going to be talking about gardens under construction and what I've learned and enjoyed from them. Among other things, I always enjoy the Japanese strange mix of sort of macho construction signage with the little rabbits and cartoon figures. But that's just an aside. After clearing the site, the first thing to do was to move some boulders and stone lanterns into place, which we did with a relatively simple wooden tripod and a block and tackle. By alternately lifting and lowering the boulder, you can allow the wooden legs to walk and move a heavy boulder, 2 tons or more, across a site in very short order. I was reminded of the wooden man getting the stone woman to dance, and also Green Mountains walking as we did this. But it is a practical method that allows even a single person to move some very heavy items and very irregular shaped items around the garden. Boulders have to be placed carefully so that they look like they belong there, that they didn't just fall off the back of a truck. And that's a strong reminder that everything in nature is where it is because of the metaphorical 72 labors. There's a reason for it. And in our human activities, we benefit when we are at least aware of those causes and conditions. I can't teach you over Zoom how to set a boulder properly, but it's a very satisfying thing when you get something this big set just right. The next thing we worked on in preparation for doing it outdoors was a dry run on some stone paving. We recycled an old millstone, which you can see at the top, a long curb and a square paver, along with some very irregular paving stones. And we were supposed to tap away and fit the paving stones together, which I was just abysmally bad at. I get them to exactly the right shape and then break them with the last hammer blow. But eventually we got it done. It's a lesson in persistence. And despite that, I really love setting the stones and composing a pattern as I go. The pattern needs to have cohesiveness. It needs to have a direction, which you see here in the long curb, for example, and a sense of flow from one place to another, directing you towards your destination. All of this is achieved not so much by paying attention to the stones, but by paying attention to the spaces in between them and how you can jiggle the stones in those spaces to make them line up and fit. Japanese gardens have what amount to adobe walls. They're mud and straw, just like the adobe, except that in New Mexico, we put it into bricks. Here, it's plastered onto reinforcement with bamboo slats, which are tied in place. A lot of Japanese construction is done by tying. Another thing that I got very little satisfaction out of because I could not work out some of the bits, but we got it done. That's why you have a team. You would think that in some places rainy as Japan, mud would not be a good or lasting option. But you, as long as you protect it with a tile roof, which is what you see on the right of the slide, you can keep a good wall repaired for decades, in fact, for centuries in some places in Japan. And you do it, oddly enough, by exploiting its softness. The erosion that happens on the surface drops a bunch of soil down at the bottom of the wall, and all you do is take it and scoop it up and put it back on the wall, and you've replastered quite successfully. So I expect you know the parable of the bamboo and the oak in the storm. The bamboo bends and the oak breaks. Mud plaster is like that too. It's a soft material that's very durable, where hard or forceful activity or materials is ultimately self-defeating. Speaking of bamboo, we actually split the 25-foot long culms or stems of the bamboo. I failed to go along with the very strong grain of the bamboo closely enough, and I have a scar on my thumb to show for it. Fortunately, this lethal-looking thing next to it, the curved metal, is a needle for sewing through to the backside of a wall where you can't see and bringing it back through the fence to tie on another piece of bamboo. The style at the upper right is one that you can't see through. It's a screen fence. The one at the lower left is an open work fence, which is kind of a permeable barrier. It marks a boundary, but it allows vision both in and out of the garden. The last picture on the screen is an unfortunate learning of, I think you can probably tell just from the complete regularity of it and the screws holding it on, that the backside of this fence is plastic bamboo, which you see an unfortunate amount of in Japan, and which actually has been part of the motivation for giving the seminars to keep the traditional arts alive. So here are a couple of photographs, different perspectives of the garden that I helped to build. It took a crew of 3 of us, I'd say about 10 solid work days to accomplish this, from tearing out the former one to this finished product. And none of us had previous experience with actually building Japanese gardens. Here's the inevitable group photo after we were finished. The students were mostly from Europe. I was the only native speaker of American or of English at all. And the main instructor spoke good English, but also German. One of the participants was Polish and another was Finnish. So the firm, I think, is accomplishing some of its goal of preserving and spreading the knowledge of Japanese gardens. They use their for-profit gardens construction firm to make it possible to create gardens in foreign countries as diplomatic gifts, basically, in hopes of international friendship. They taught me something directly too, that I need to temper my usual suspicion of business people when you realize that there are people who will use their wealth to do something like this. So I'd like to talk a little bit about one thing that we all know as Zen practitioners, but many ordinary garden clients don't. Gardens have to be maintained. And sweeping and raking the garden is almost a definition of the Zen monk traditionally. It's a caricature almost. But the garden is really inextricable from the monk and the monk from the garden. The garden is a place where living beings take care of other living beings. Gardening, and particularly the maintenance of gardening, is a very repetitive job. And because it's repetitive, over time, it sneaks up on you and manifests as connection, as intimacy. And as such, it's a Zen master's best tool for helping students in those directions. Well, maybe not best. Zen deserves its day too. But when you think about how this kind of work is done, how it's scheduled, and the kind of focus it takes, it's exactly right as a partner for seated Zen practice and any other form of meditation for that matter. Of course, when I first was assigned to weeding extensive grounds, I was sure that the monks were punishing me. I didn't know for what. There's a lesson in there somewhere, but I'm not sure I've learned it yet. Now, what I'd like to share with you for the rest of the talk is a little bit of information or interpretive skill, perhaps, in understanding the meaning and the joy of the way that gardens are built. You've seen some of the methods, and now I want to look at some of the implications, I guess you'd call it. Japanese design and construction very often is about breaking categories or habitual assumptions or dichotomies. Here you have a path that is partly made of cut stone, something that's obviously been worked by people, and the rest of it's made of unworked stone in what appear to be random shapes that are interlocking. Interestingly enough, this stone breaks out of either type of material. And here, even though the destination is still further on, path changes to non-path, and you get these stepping stones. So there's been a very sophisticated violation of the obvious rules of construction and of design here. These kind of details are always halfway between construction and design and have to involve a skilled partnership between the person who thinks up the design and the person who actualizes it. Here's another example where a flaw in the rectangular manufactured rock is just filled in with more of the cobbles that have been used elsewhere. This reminds me a lot of the gold repair that Roshi Enkyo talked about that's used on ceramics, where you emphasize the cracks and the flaws by repairing them with a noticeable material. This is at least in the same spirit, although these are not gold nuggets. In the United States and Europe, we don't do this kind of paving. We get what is rightly called crazy paving. It's monotonously the same size. It has no direction or flow. And the color mix is so wild that it almost succeeds in making stone garish, which is really hard to do with a natural material. Another thing that represents the same feeling of broken categories is really a garden that is addressing the great matter of life and death, because here you have a wall made out of dried golden bamboo twigs, and behind it is a living bamboo grove. I have had a career in landscape architecture for many, many years, and I don't think I have ever seen this kind of juxtaposition in a Western style garden. This is a remarkable message to get from a fairly ordinary garden barrier, that the mass of living green overarches the traces of it and will outlast this dead construction, even beautiful as it is. This one could be interpreted the same way, but you can also look at it as a contrast between order and regularity and control, and the kind of diversity and slight imperfections that you always get in actual living things. If you take this idea and scale it up one scale, so you're looking at the whole garden, this is the famous stone garden at Yoanji. And many people think of it as a gravel rectangle surrounded by plain vanilla walls. And as you can see by looking closer, it's anything but. And one of the things that is juxtaposed here is all the vegetation outside. This garden wouldn't be even remotely famous if that life and abundance wasn't outside of the raked, pure, sacred space. I think they borrowed the idea of plain white gravel as marking sacred space from Shinto. But you can see how much these trees, and even the ones further away, benefit the understanding of the specialness of the interior garden. There's also a very interesting aspect to the wall. It's considered a national treasure in its own right. It's a mud wall, but it was built with mud that was soaked in oil. And that's why it has all of these naturalistic kinds of patterns on the wall. I was once given the privilege of, hold on a second, my computer is thinking it's going to run out of juice. There we go. I was given the privilege of sitting all night beside this garden. And in the morning, one of the things I saw was another landscape receding into this wall, and different stones inside that different wall. Take that how you will, but by being adventurous with the construction, they've added another entire layer of meaning to this garden. So context and the whole are really critical with gardens, because they're not enclosures. They're open, at least on one side, being upwards, usually on more sides than that. So you borrow the landscape from outside and get a completely different reading of the space than you would if this wasn't here. In fact, by contrast, here's a garden that has every element of a Japanese garden. It's got weeping, deformed trees, dwarf trees. I won't take any responsibility for the pink flamingo. It's got stepping stones, cobbles, white gravel, and the only thing, well, an astroturf. The only thing you can really do is raise compassion for this poor space. The last bit of embodied garden teaching, if you will permit me to call it that, that I'd like to share is conveying a very sophisticated understanding of a relationship between humans and nature. Most traditional Japanese residences and many traditional official buildings as well have this veranda that is known as an engawa. And it is a between space. It's neither inside nor outside, or maybe both. And the designers of Japanese gardens often seem to be using this space and its ambiguity to talk about how we relate to nature. The house, which is to the right, is of course a complete shelter. On 6 sides, it has barriers to the outside. The Engawa has essentially 3 sides. You're sheltered by the roof, you're sheltered from little flood water underneath your Engawa, and you have the building to your back. But you're open here. If you go down from the Engawa, you do so on rectangular cut stones that are very carefully placed to make steps. They're placed into a rectangular, essentially gutter for draining the roof that's full of stones. But that rectangle is broken by the darker of the 2 stones. It sticks out beyond what otherwise would be a plain boundary. You're getting further and further away from human control as you go. The house is completely controlled environment, and this is less so, less so, less so. And finally, you get down to the stepping stones, which are rough, unworked, and whose layout kind of wanders over to the most densely forested part of the site. And so what I see this as talking about is the coexistence, necessary coexistence of human construction and control and natural growth. I'm sure there are experts who would try to argue me out of that, but they'll have a hard time. I'm pretty set in that opinion. Here's a more elaborate layout with an engawa that wraps around in a Z shape here. You can see the second wing of the house to the back and the right. Here, the stepping down is not as obvious, but the large rock right by the orange fish is carefully selected, both for being a near cylinder and for having a fairly flat place to stand. And then the little stepping stones wander away into the dense vegetation on the opposite shore. I'm not making up deliberate Zen illusions here, but that very much tells that kind of story. I don't want to shortchange our own tradition, so I want to show you this one last slide. This is in West Philadelphia, where I used to live. It could be in parts of New York City or London or many European cities. And the concern here, the social concern, was not man and nature. It was private space and public space. So if you start in the house, that is private space. In fact, it is subdivided into semi-public parts of the private space, like the drawing room, which you would be ushered into if you came visiting. But basically, it's a complete enclosure and it's a private space. You go out onto the porch here. That, like the Engawa, is partially sheltered and it's a semi-private space. If the owners are sitting up there in their lawn chairs, people are not just going to walk up unless they're good friends. It's semi-private. That space is raised above the garden. You see the steps coming down here. And it's also divided from the garden with a series of vertical elements, these posts and the balustrade along the edge of the porch. In many cases, that's repeated once more, and you have a cast iron fence where the garden steps down to the sidewalk, and that fence will almost always be made up of little spear-shaped vertical elements that repeat the spatial separation of the porch. The sidewalk is public pedestrian space, but to make it clear that cars and vehicles aren't allowed, there's one more barrier made of vertical elements, which are the street trees. And at that point, again, there's a step down and you end up in the completely public street. So like the Japanese example, there's a very sophisticated continuum of design and construction in these kind of old-fashioned row houses. Unfortunately, this kind of reading of architectural and landscape space is losing ground, to put it poetically. It's been wiped out by modernist minimalism and by commercial cheapness. But this is why I think that the Japanese workshop was not only important, but succeeded in many of its goals. So I'm going to jump back onto the screen here, assuming my tech keeps working. Yeah, there we are. How about that? I want to just close with something that I found in a small, wonderful book, a bilingual book on Japanese craftsmanship. That's called Koge in Japanese, Kogei. It refers to all types of craftsmanship, including many things that we would call art. Maybe not the finest art. We get very hoity-toity about that. But a professor from the Kyoto Institute of Technology wrote this book, and he comments that in this Japanese tradition of Koge, items are made according to a different set of principles than what governs the production of mass manufactured consumables. And he gives the characteristics of those kinds of methods of making objects, construction, if you will, although at a small scale, we probably don't use that word. He says that craft items of koge, are carefully made by hand, one by one, which is what my seminar was all about in terms of gardens. They're generally made from local, common, ordinary materials. They're intended to be cared for and to last. They're not disposable. They're durable enough that they will outlive a careful owner and be passed down to generations, and in that way shape future societies as well as current ones. And they improve in quality, patina, appearance with more use. The more you use them, the better they work and the better they look. And because they're made with local materials, their waste implications are very low. These characteristics of craftsmanship and artistry certainly can be applied to the traditional garden in Japan. It takes a great deal of skill to do what we did better than we did it. We were definitely amateurs and just learning. But the gentleman who sponsored this and taught it were real craftsmen in this sense. In the West, we tend to determine whether something is a craft or an art by who made it and how famous they are and how good their marketing is. In Japan, it seems that craft is distinguished from everything else by the avoidance of schlocky materials and flimsy results and unsustainable methods. Since I've had an interest in sustainability for a very long time, it feels like that idea that careful craft can bring us beauty and joy without sliding over into a luxury that is unnecessary, and contribute to a sustainable society and to sustainable ways of living. Besides giving us a lifelong connection to what we call in Zen mountains and rivers and the great earth. Thank you very much.